decided that I was to go to Oundle Public School in the summer term of 1924. The summer was considered a more agreeable time for breaking the ice, an occupation that was sometimes all too literally accurate in north-eastern Northamptonshire. The housemaster of my house, Dryden House, was H.O. Hale. In the 1920s, it was still often assumed that many public schoolmasters were in holy orders, and one happy day a letter came for the Reverend H. O'Hale, allotting him a supposedly Irish provenance. But Mr. Hale was entirely English, and therefore in a constant state of anxiety about our moral welfare. There were a number of rules which he evidently hoped were a foolproof recipe for chastity. A boy could not speak to anybody a year older than himself. Smiles, too, were out, for smiling spelt danger, a go-ahead to depravity. Conversely, a boy couldn't speak to or smile at anybody younger than himself, and a boy could in no circumstances mix socially with a boy of whatever age in another house. This was, for some muddled reason, thought to be especially perilous. I found it well-nigh impossible not to smile, and for a time I was considered to be rather fast. Every so often, Mr. Hale delivered himself of a moral lecture, designed to scare the pants off one and all. He had composed a striking opening sentence: "This house is a midden." Only the cleverer boys knew what a midden was, but the word's general meaning became clear as the pie-jaw progressed. In my day at Oundle, Dryden House was one of the few remaining so-called proprietary houses, in which a housemaster was given a yearly sum of money with which to run the house and make what profit he might for himself. Mr. Hale and his wife provided good breakfasts and excellent lunches, but the rest of the day represented a falling off. Supper at 7 o'clock consisted of what is known as a cooked dish. On one occasion, a dashing and fastidious boy registered his disapproval of minced meat on toast by cutting up the toast and, with the mince, fashioning a word of 4 letters, a word beginning, I regret to say, with the letter S. The maid who waited on his table, outraged at this insult, bore the plate away to Mr. Hale. The head boy was instantly summoned, and the plate was held out to him to examine. Once more, a striking opening sentence was provided. What, may I ask, is the meaning of this noisome motto? Not an easy question to answer acceptably. The culprit was, I need hardly say, soundly thrashed. But in my 4 years as a boy at Oundle, I don't remember a single instance of anybody trying to run away. Oundle wasn't a place that people wanted to run away from. I don't know whether the Guinness Book of Records lists the name of the boy who ran away most often from school, but at this late stage I would like to put forward a candidate. He lived in the Wirral and was a friend of many of us. His name was Edward Bates, and the school from which Eddie departed so frequently was Winchester College. His mode of departure was simple: no lengthy preparations, no food parcels and means of disguise. He just went. Sometimes he was up and away before first light. Anybody seen Bates? Sometimes he left mid-morning and after attending a lesson or two. Sometimes the mood took him in the afternoon. His parents, Sir Percy and Lady Bates, bore all stoically. The first indication was usually a call from the lodge-keeper and his wife at the gates, to the effect that they thought they had seen Master Edward walking up the drive. I forget the exact number of absences in 1 year, indeed the only year when Eddie was, or rather was not, at Winchester, but it may well have reached double figures. He remembered with particular pleasure the final episode. Asked by Mr. Popejoy, his housemaster, whether he would now give an undertaking to behave himself, Eddie gave a wild cry of "No, no, no!" and, flinging out an arm, managed to knock over a small table on which reposed Mr. Popejoy's treasured collection of bibelots and knickknacks, all of which fell to the floor with a satisfying tinkle. Like many of us, some of the instruction that I received at school was patchy. In my youth, all those who strove to teach me history strove in vain. Formality reigned. Nobody ever read us a stirring account of, say, a Chartist rising or a nice massacre somewhere. Instead, day after day, we sat solemnly at our desks and learnt dates. I defy anybody to get a crumb of comfort or intellectual stimulus from English Regain Madras, 1749, or Siege of Danzig, 1734. When we had learnt enough dates for the time being, we learnt the terms of the Treaty of Ulm, 1620, and I really cannot recommend them to you. And thus it is that the world's most sensational events, death of Mahomet, invention of the spinning jenny, De Ruyter's fleet in the Thames, the cheek of it, still leave me tremendously cold. But I am very fortunate, for I can truthfully say I have never in my life been bored, however inviting the circumstances. The most severe challenge was, I suppose, provided by the chapel services at Oundle in the 1920s. I do resent, even at this rather late stage, having had such vast chunks of the Old Testament read at me. Not a day went by without some mirthless twaddle about unleavened bread or the wormwood and the gall. When a dog-collared divine, clutching the lectern, let fly with, "Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah?" A rhetorical question, apparently, for answer came there none. One was quite frankly nonplussed. Where was Edom, and where, as though one cared, Bozrah? And why was almost everybody in the Old Testament permanently ratty and disagreeable, with God, whom we were constantly thanking for this or that, by far the rattiest of the lot? Choral singing was an important feature of Oundle musical life. I enjoyed it immensely, and my apparent musicality encouraged an over-enthusiastic music master to enter me for a choral scholarship at Caius College, Cambridge. I was doomed from the start, but it meant an opportunity of seeing Cambridge, where I was soon to go. An Oundle friend who had preceded me by a year or two kindly asked me to dine with him in Clare. He was an agreeable and, to me, worldly character, who had an elder brother who flew about in a private aeroplane, and had once asked me during a holiday outing to send a telegram to his home announcing that he would be late back. This seemed to me tremendously dashing. Telegrams in my family were productive of ashen faces and hands pressed to bosoms. One neither sent them nor was ever late back. So it was no surprise to find in my friend's rooms a very smart red-leather HMV portable gramophone and the latest musical comedy records, a drinks table, copies of The Bystander, several framed photographs of girls, shingled and marcelled to within an inch of their lives, and my friend vigorously shaking a White Lady cocktail. But next morning, to coin a phrase, I had to face the music. I had soon to reveal the fact that my voice, although in tune and extremely loud when needed, was brassy and altogether horrible. Furthermore, I looked, while singing, repulsive. The three judges smiled politely and requested scales. "How high can you sing?" asked Dr. Mann of King's. I named a note, and he struck it. I obliged. "Go on," he said. and so up I squeaked, ever higher, into regions where only dogs, poor things, could hear me. I then did about a quarter of the set Handelian piece, Thank You, smartly failed the sight reading, and was being speedily shown to the door when I remembered my Song of the Candidate's Own Choosing. Yes, they said, and so back I went and wailed it out, Thank You. When I returned to Oundle, the music master wanted to know how I had fared. Do you feel you've pulled it off? I don't think so, I said. Although my parents' final goal for me, that of schoolmastering, was abhorrent, I greatly took to the idea of Cambridge. I wanted to go to King's, but my Uncle Oswald's time there had not been without incident, and he had fallen foul of a humorless but distinguished don called Clapham. Pause for an old Punch joke of my childhood. Muddled old gentleman to railway porter. Tell me, porter, does this train clap at Stopham Junction? It was thought wiser, therefore, to enter me for a more modest college, and so Christ's was settled on, if a college could be called modest that had produced Milton and Darwin. My parents had another admirable idea. As I was to read modern languages, why not remove me from Oundle a term early and send me to spend the summer with a French family where I could attend the summer course for foreign students at Grenoble University. And so, in May 1928, I and two others set off for a Grenoble suburb called La Tronche, and a house which catered for students and was run by three spinster sisters called Roland. There is usually something odd about sisters that come in triplicate. The sisters Roland were no exception. There was poor, frail Mademoiselle Alice, a middle-aged poetess, who had in her youth ranked as the sweet songbird of Savoy and possessed printed books to prove it. Then there was Mademoiselle Cécile, a sad victim of toothache, who, usually fresh from the dentist's chair, sat with a hand pressed to her jaw and a repetitious cry of "Ah, que je souffre." The robust physique of the third sister, Mademoiselle Berthe, was, I suppose, nature's way of redressing the balance. Amazement at her sturdy build was only equalled by amazement at her appetite. She provided me with my first experience of oil-soused lettuce being eaten as only a rarely hungry Frenchwoman can eat it. To install me safely at Cambridge, a double carload of relations was assembled, and off we went. My Essex grandmother and my Uncle Oswald, and a raffish friend of his, being grandly chauffeur-driven in one car, and my parents and I and my cousin Madge, indispensable on occasions of family importance, in the other. We inspected my lodgings, deposited my luggage, and then lunched on roast pork at the University Arms Hotel. When the time came for them all to go, my mother said, "Now it's up to you, darling." They had such high hopes for me, and I knew only too well they were to be disappointed. They had mistaken diligence for brains. From about the age of 4 to 18, I had been a model of conscientious endeavour, and I had had enough of it. I briskly began to let everybody down. On the evening of our first day, an old school friend, Maurice Johnson, came round to my rooms, and we set about trying to join the Amateur Dramatic Club, which had its own small theatre, dressing-rooms and club-room in Park Street. The club had started life in rather grand circumstances, and among its former presidents was the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. Would we wondered, pass muster? We worried needlessly. Morris had discovered that the club's secretary was a Trinity undergraduate called Robert Edison, and thither, after hall, we repaired. Robert welcomed us warmly and was reassuring about membership and audition requirements. And so we became members of the club that came to be my daytime home for most of my 3 years. A printed card summoned me to a first meeting with my tutor. He was unfailingly courteous, and it was no fault of his that to me and many of my friends he seemed a fearfully cold fish. For our 3 years' association he called me Mr. Marshall, which was accurate but in itself discouraging. Even now, 50 years on, if I walk through Christ's and look up at what were the windows of his rooms, I have a feeling of unease. In my first fortnight, I busied myself visiting old school friends in other colleges, and there then arrived another little printed card inviting me to call on my tutor at the socially productive hour of 6:15 p.m. Hooray, I thought, envisaging a small party for fellow freshmen with glasses of sherry. Not at all. I was the only one so summoned, and was informed of college rule number 273C, or whatever, which forbade undergraduates being out after 10 p.m. more than 3 times a week. I had, it seems, been out 6 times in each week, the complete social butterfly, and must now toe the line. You are here to work, Mr. Marshall. In this respect, I had defiant news for the college, and it was, you can lead a horse to the water. My rooms were in Hobson Street, in a handsome Queen Anne house which stood conveniently at the back gate of Christ's. A minute's walk brought me to the brightly lit Central Cinema, 2 minutes to the Dorothy Café, known to us as the Dot, and within 4 minutes I could be in the Amateur Dramatic Club. Most of my friends were in King's, John's, and Magdalen, and no distance away, and, like everybody else, I bicycled to and fro. The bicycle, which I had had for some years, was nearing the end of its active life, so my father had proffered his own machine, and I didn't like to refuse. But there was an embarrassment. Where the ordinary man's bicycle had a straight horizontal bar, my father's dipped down into a V shape, though not as far down as on a lady's bicycle, giving it the appearance of being neither male nor female. As a result, it became rapidly known to my friends as the hermaphrodite. But the bicycle had at least one advantage. Nobody else would have been seen dead on it, and it never got stolen. Just to test the ground, I sampled a lecture or two. The accepted procedure among the non-diligent was to attend the first lectures of the year, and then to attend no more. In my day, the general standard of lecturing in modern languages was deplorable. Some lecturers just read out typed sheets. Others mumbled and twittered. Few could present their subjects attractively. There were, however, 2 glorious exceptions, 2 women. Miss Pernell Strachey, a lady who had inherited that family's failure to be boring, and Professor Elsie Butler, who early won my heart by referring to Goethe as poor old Goethe, an opinion I had long shared. When she added poor old Schiller, I was at her feet for evermore. These 2 splendidly intelligent ladies were a rare eye-opener for me, for the ordinary and comfortable middle-class Berkshire circles in which I was then living contained no intellectual ladies of any sort. Nobody narrowed their eyes at one and talked about Proust. Modern composers, if spoken of at all, were referred to as freaks, an opinion with which, in some cases, I am still inclined to agree. At Cambridge, I found to my dismay that in French literature we were to concern ourselves yet again with the plays of that dread couple, Racine and Corneille, and during my last 2 years at Oundle we had done little else. And Oundle had had an advantage, namely a teacher called A.C. Bray, who took the modern 6. He was in every way dynamic, and I owe him much. With his decibels mounting with his blood pressure, the noise alone rendered it impossible to snooze, as he boomed out the French classical plays in such a dramatic manner one could fancy oneself positively at the Comédie itself. His exertions frequently caused his nose to bleed, upon which he lay flat on the floor and carried on with phage from the prone position. Perhaps understandably, he had a special affection for Cyrano de Bergerac, which came to electrifying life, dual scene and all, before our very eyes. When, at the end, the heroine Roxane, now retired to a nunnery where the autumn leaves are symbolically falling, realizes that the old nobleman, wounded and dying hideously before her, is the man she has really loved all her life, Mr. Bray could be seen to be weeping, and the less hard-boiled among us wept with him. Nevertheless, I very much doubt the wisdom of exposing youngish persons to the plays of Racine and Corneille. If they knew any jokes, they kept them to themselves, and the play's characters were too remote from life. And no one at Cambridge matched A.C. Bray as a teacher. Most of my contemporaries were given an allowance by their parents, but my father preferred to pay all college and university accounts and leave me without worry, though every vac I was expected to hand him a list of my petty cash disbursements. The items required careful doctoring, for he would certainly have disapproved of many of them, and so I quite shamelessly disguised my frequent cinema visits as offertory money, subscription to RSPCA, and trip to Ely Cathedral. My parents were admirably businesslike over money and accounts, and all sums, great or small, were written down and totted up. Then you knew where you were, a favourite phrase. I did once strive to emulate them, and I bought a small account book. I have it still, and it has just one entry in it. Account book, 1 shilling and 6pence. Let me admit at once that I tried everything I knew not to become a schoolmaster. I wanted to go into the theatre. The whole idea of schoolmastering depressed me, especially the thought of returning to Oundle in a magisterial capacity. I dreaded the whole business, and after I'd come down from the university in 1931, warfare broke out between me and my parents. I behaved as badly as I knew how. I whined, I moaned, I shuddered, I wriggled. I showered Royal Academy of Dramatic Art brochures on them. But gradually, with no fight left in me, I abandoned all thought of a career in the theatre, and back to Oundle I duly went, quaking in my shoes. I gather that modern schoolmasters display, and why shouldn't they, a lively interest in creature comforts. At job interviews, they're apt to ask searching questions. In my day, any question from an applicant was rare, and to show an interest in whether one had or had not a bathroom to oneself, had not was the normal, would have sharply concluded the interview. I didn't like the young man's attitude. The boarding houses of Oundle School are divided between the so-called field houses and town houses, and I found that I had been appointed house tutor in a town house called Laundimer. My study was a smallish room on the ground floor, and as at that time it contained the house library books as well as me, privacy was intermittent. "It will give you a chance to get to know the boys," encouraged the housemaster, Mr. Alt. Well, yes, I suppose so. The sole window looked out directly onto North Street, up and down which there rumbled day and night lorries from the Peterborough brick fields. My bedroom, even smaller, was on the floor above. I shared a lavatory with Mr. Alt, and I was somewhat taken aback on learning that I could only have a bath 3 times a week, and even then in the boys' bathroom. These ablutionary excitements took place on half-holidays between 6 and 6:30 p.m. If I had lingered longer than 6:30, I would have found myself having a bath with the matron, Miss Tomlinson. Miss Tomlinson had a dog which she had rashly christened Jerry, innocently providing schoolboy jokes. "Please, sir, have you seen Miss Tomlinson's Jerry?" But the food, supervised by Mrs. Alt, was first-rate. The Alts welcomed me warmly, and I soon settled in.